Ready in 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Nerds of Legend. I'm your co-host, Ben, and next to me is Brendan. It's just going to be the two of us today, and we're going to be talking about Warhammer 40k. We're going to start by talking about some of the origins way back when it started. We're going to get a little bit of lore discussion in, but right now we're just going to be focusing on the beginning with Games Workshop, Rogue Trader, and all that fun stuff. So, Brendan, without further ado, take us away.
And to dork it up. Appreciate you being here, Ben. I don't know if everybody in Nerds of Legend is as nerdy as we are. So.
Everyone's got their own things that they nerd out about, of course. But
yes, and you can see very, very far away, Ben's got his books behind him.
I think I think you and I go furthest afield in terms of our various nerd things. But
yes, to be sure.
Just waiting for my Leviathan box to come in.
I also ordered my Leviathan box. So, most viewers and most friends that I know are initially intimidated.
It is.
And by Games Workshop in general, you have the price point, you have the complexity of picking up painting miniatures. It's taken me. I've been painting since I was 16, and there's still things for me to learn. I'm new to Zenithal. Some of you may not even know what that means. New to NMM. There's all sorts of new painting techniques that have come out along with new paints. It's a different science than it was even 15 years ago.
Right.
So with all of those things stacked on top of each other, it's a very similar question that I get from people who talk to me who have seen the MCU that
right.
want to know about comics. They're like, where do I begin? There are so many places to enter and weave in and out.
And I think I asked you 4 or 5 different times where I should start, and you just said, and then I think the latest gateway, we're seeing a sort of resurgence in interest in 40k. I feel like I think one of the big points is you've got like Adeptus Ridiculous, which I feel like makes it a really easy way to like get in. Like that's how I got into 40k, because it like they broke it down. It's like talking to like guy that knows nothing about 40k versus guy that knows everything about 40k, and you sort of get it put into digestible chunks, which is nice because you start looking at some of the lore videos and you get some guys that are always going to be talking like this and talk about how badass it is and blah blah blah, and then you've got guys that are like, well, actually, And I feel like there was no in between, and that we're gonna try and make it like a little bit of fun. We're gonna try not to go like super in the lore and quotes and stuff, but I don't know what Brendan's got in store for us. But
I don't have any music. I don't have any ambiance. I don't have a voice modulator to sound like a space marine.
Yeah.
I'm not here to rake the coals.
I mean, I do, but
yeah, you do. It's very rare for someone in the streaming community to talk about 40Ks if they're just hanging out with you in the basement, we're in our respective basements, right? Yeah. It's either in the 41st millennium, or it's a guy like in your face with big expressions and bullshit. I'm going to talk about it the way I learned it, spending all of my weekends in high school. Losing my money on it and running books to the library and sometimes paying for them and sometimes getting PDFs. Because that's the thing. My first memories of 40K are looking in issues of White Dwarf magazine. I'd like to do an episode on White Dwarf magazine. It's the official magazine of Games Workshop. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, it's very much half 40K, half Age of Sigmar. There's some Tolkien in there. And occasionally specialist games like Blood Bowl. So it's primarily the product line for Games Workshop. Back in the day, there were so many varied products. We're going to start with the origins of Games Workshop because it gives us... it's not completely going to be about the origins of the company, but it'll give us a nice historical perspective for how 40K came to be. I feel like people are either talking about lore, actually primarily talking about lore or the game. No one is talking about the history of the company, really. I highly recommend a book called Dice Men. It came out, I think it's within a year. It's Diceman, the origin story of Games Workshop. It's by Ian Livingstone with Steve Jackson, two of the three founders of the company. It talks about the complete origins of the company. It started out in 1975, and Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader started in 1986. Mm-hmm. So the company and the game both predate my existence. So I came into it seeing these splendid full-color art prints of these armies and this very vibrant goblin green base. And the 90s were very tubular. You had like red nails and everything was shiny and extreme. And as a kid, you don't have that money.
Back in the lead days.
Yes, primarily there were lead. There were a multi-part. My first box set was the 3rd edition 40K box set. It was the Black Templars versus the Dark Eldar, and you got a land speeder. And I learned, I actually, the benefits of being a dork. Last year, I talked to one of the VPs of sales from Games Workshop throughout that period. I met him at Gen Con. He was running the auction hall. And we talked about it, 1999. He said the 3rd ed box set, the Black Templars were invented so children could enter the game more easily because they're black and white. So they're
yeah.
So everything has this business perspective to it. But if we go back to the origins of the company, before Ian and Steve left and sold their stock and sold their stake, and before Rick Priestley left, who was the premier rules writer for Rogue Trader, you saw a lot of ideas and you saw creativity over profit. And I think that's why people look at it with rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
So I'll take us through a very, very quick origin of the company. If you want to really get into that, I highly recommend the book Diceman. It started in 1975. It was a mail order business, part-time. So they had a flat in West London, and I think for 3 years they sold like Mancala and like board games and chess and stuff like that.
Yeah, they're just the Monopoly and Sorry and Parcheesi.
Extremely humble beginnings. So like Nintendo sold Hanafuda Japanese playing cards before they ever got into video games. Games Workshop is no exception.
I won trivia night last night with that answer. So
really,
yeah.
For our viewers, volleyball was once known as Mintonet. I lost that at a trivia night. So that'll help you. But yeah, they sold primarily board game accessories and board games. And you'll notice a lot of young gaming businesses that are now thought of, with renown, jumped on what was needed at the time. And you think of like Saban with the Power Rangers. He saw those Super Sentai shows in Japan. Thought, hey, maybe there's a market for that in the United States. And there was the anime boom in the 80s. Hey, why don't we just get some bucks together and just get the distribution rights in the U.S. for some of these anime shows and see if we can make some money?
Right.
Well, D&D was getting very big in the U.S. in the approaching the late 70s. Word of it had reached the United Kingdom. And they had an import license, Games Workshop, to distribute Dungeons & Dragons memorabilia. And then there was a need for miniatures. And it wasn't necessarily easy to bring Grenadier miniatures over. So what ended up happening is, after importing the rules, in some of the earliest pictures of Games Workshop, you actually see players' handbooks and stuff on the walls. There was an adjoining company, Citadel Miniatures, was the miniatures wing of Games Workshop. And they thought, hey, why don't we sculpt our own miniatures that we can sell for Dungeons & Dragons? And if you've heard of 2000 AD, the very popular comic book series of which Judge Dredd comes from, I think there's like Judge Death and there's Judge Anderson. There's all these characters. I think maybe, is it Rogue Trooper or Rebel Trooper? It's been a hot minute since I've read them. But Judge Dredd, the license for Judge Dredd miniatures was picked up by Games Workshop. They were able to distribute, I believe,
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings had official miniatures that Games Workshop carried. Once they started launching White Dwarf in the late 70s, their hobby magazine, if you look at really early issues, it was essentially a newsletter.
Yeah.
So
this is what's coming out. Order now.
Yeah. You see in the back, they sold stuff for D&D. They sold stuff for 2000 AD. They sold miniatures for Lovecraftian horror. like Dracula and the Mummy, and anything to get a buck.
Yeah.
If you look at your hobby shops now, you're selling Magic the Gathering, you're selling comic books, you're selling Funko Pop, you're selling
40K.
Anything to get profit. So at the time, they were carrying a lot of licenses. Now, 40K, we're jumping a little bit, but like even the Adeptus Arbites, who are like the space cops in the Hive worlds in the 40K lore, even if you don't know what that is yet, just know that was taken from Games Workshop having the license to Judge Dredd and saying, hey, if we manipulate the molds a little bit, we can use these miniature molds and make these guys. Yeah. A lot of Warhammer 40,000 out of necessity was born out of taking intellectual property and tweaking it. Yeah. So the Adeptus Arbites were taken from Judge Dredd. The Mechanicus was taken from Foundation. The Chaos Gods, Chaos is the big bad in 40K, did not exist when Rogue Trader came out. That has extreme ties to Elric of Melnibone and the Eternal Warrior stuff from that series of fantasy books, which, guess what? Games Workshop had a miniatures line for Elric and for Pantang, the nation of his rivals, and so on. So Games Workshop took a lot of these ideas that they already had and said, hey, let's tweak them and have our own property. So predicating Warhammer 40,000, you have Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Mm-hmm. And Warhammer Fantasy Battle is just as it sounds. You had dwarves, you had elves, you had Skaven, the Ratmen, which were, I believe, more or less a creation of Games Workshop. Yeah. Other than straight up.
The only thing they didn't steal. No, I'm kidding.
heavy influences to Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, Bretonnians
are literally Arthurian legend. You have Green Knight from Arthurian legend. You have Guy Legros and Hugo Le Petit are Little John and Friar Tuck. Yeah. And you have these Réponse de Léonesse is pretty much Joan of Arc. And so you have a lot of folklore and Lord of the Rings stuff put directly into Fantasy Battle. And that arose from a need to, hey, let's have some rules with these miniatures. D&D's origins lie in a miniatures role-play set called Chainmail. And so there was a need, hey, let's sling more lead. Especially as they eventually lose the D&D license. They eventually lose the 2000 AD license. Yeah. They eventually lose the Eternal Warrior license. And you'll see throughout the history of the miniatures line that they'll tweak or retire or mix the miniatures line into what they are.
Yeah, they'll lose the license and they're like, well, we still have these molds laying around. Let's make something that is similar but different.
Yeah. I'm a bit of a dork for the individual artistic styles of the sculptors. Jez Goodwin is a titan in Games Workshop. He designed the Falcon Grav tank of the Eldar, and he designed a lot of the entire Wood Elf line and the Skaven line from the early 80s. And he designed the Melniboneans from the book series, and they just made them elves. They just rolled them into the Warhammer miniatures line.
Right.
So what ends up happening is there's an interest for science fiction miniatures. And at the time, the original founders of the company, Ian Livingstone, Steve Jackson, I believe it was also John Peake, said, hey, there's this market for fantasy miniatures. By this point, they have a store off Dowling Road in Hammersmith, London. Mm-hmm. They've had a store since April of 1978. And there's a gentleman named Rick Priestley who's working at the company. And they decided, hey, we have a very successful line of fantasy miniatures. Let's get something going for science fiction.
Well, didn't Sean, he was like on eBay or something, and he ended up as like one of the big main sculptors for like 40K, and then it found out like the guy was like selling off his stuff, and he used to be like one of the big sculptors for them or something.
Yeah, so a lot of the original contributors to Games Workshop missed out on what you could call the corporate wealth.
Yeah.
So like Ansel, a lot of the original White Dwarf employees that worked in the magazine that I grew up reading Jervis Johnson, Gav Thorpe, and these are names to me, like these guys were at Adepticon.
Household names, yeah.
Almost weeping because I was reading everything they were writing
for
years. and they got run out of the company or sold their stake and got out. And I mean, it's a publicly traded company now. In the 80s, in the late 80s and the 90s, this was not the case. It was a lot of very passionate individuals contributing.
Yeah.
You know, so what ends up happening is you can find on eBay, my brother has and I have, original green stuff dummies, like the original sculpts of unreleased miniatures, of miniatures that were cast for the company, from the sculptors themselves. So, which a lot of them carry their own sculpting businesses now. So Bob Ollie runs his own business. Is it Nick Bibby, maybe? There's a lot of individuals. The Foundry Miniatures, the Perry brothers sculpted the entire Bretonian line. They continue to sculpt and sell their own. Ellie Morrison, she has her own company. These are names you might not know, but if you look at old catalogs of all the miniatures, these individuals sculpted all of these by hand. Green stuff, milliput, they use copper wiring sometimes. Invented, in a lot of cases, the sculpting techniques to create feathers and chainmail and armor, and made this by hand in the back of Hammersmith, London, this Games Workshop location. So to think that so many people were listening to death metal and didn't like Margaret Thatcher and just hung out in their 30s, and just read comics and sculpted the stuff, and now it's this massive conglomerate, this massive publicly traded corporation.
It's just crazy because like we were talking about this the other day. It was it's like you go back to the beginning of 40K and it was just a bunch of like nerdy metalheads that like didn't like Thatcher, and they were like, what if the future of humanity is like this? And they like made a whole thing about it. And so like, but also bring in all of our favorite like sci-fi fantasy stuff. Ooh, There we go.
So this is the Stuff Legends. I highly recommend it if you're interested in treasure hunting for defunct minis that Games Workshop used to make. They cover multiple companies, Grenadier, I believe they have Marauder. So lots of companies for old defunct games. These are painted examples of the original 2018 line. These eventually became the Adeptus Arbites, the Space Cops that you see in the Necromunda games in the 40K universe.
Could totally see it.
Yeah. They got mutants, they got perps, based on the comic books. You can see. Let's see.
We'll go back
to
where you just were.
Oh, okay. There's all sorts of
never mind. It's
one judges. Yeah, so these are original rips from catalogs.
Yeah.
So you can go to painted examples and you can see Strontium Dog and Johnny Alpha is a character from the comics. So these are literal comic book characters that they have held the rights to.
Go to the Mutants tab again.
Mutants tab.
Scroll down. Oh, look, there's an orc.
Oh, yeah. Wearing a dress.
Yeah.
So, not good. Rhode Island Red, he's got a rooster head because he's mutated.
Yeah.
All these ridiculous sculpts. And you can tell these were done by hand.
Yeah.
And cast in soft lead. Eventually, approaching the mid-'80s, Games Workshop actually came up with a technique called slata basing, where there's a small piece of metal that connects both of the feet.
Mm-hmm.
You can take the miniature and there's a plastic gap. There's a gap called the slata that you just stick the miniature in on the base. You glue it and you can base over it, and the mini easily plugs into the base. Before that time, they were casting the base of the miniature. The
whole thing. Yeah.
With the miniature, and so they were saving money this way. There were fewer mold errors and issues and that sort of thing. So at the time, they were revolutionizing the business. They came up with slata base. They covered multiple lines of intellectual property, and they were starting to pick up speed. And so what ends up happening is Warhammer Fantasy Battle has been out for some time. It predates 40K.
Mm-hmm.
And Rick Priestley's approach with, hey, let's come up with a science fiction game. Now, the thing with Warhammer 40,000 : Road Trainer, this is the original name of the first edition of the game.
Yeah.
It is presented as a role-playing game, a tabletop role-playing game. You have a game master. So
really?
There are not only two opponents, but there's an individual who's actually refereeing the game. So it has very role-playing elements to D&D. I don't know if Call of Duty was out by that time, but a lot of tabletop games requiring miniatures, there was a game minister. So there's this very obvious genealogy to role-playing games. And what ends up happening is all of the... I actually have a scan of the original rulebook up. All of the terms that are now synonymous and heavily copyrighted with Games Workshop. So the Imperial Assassins, Rogue Traders, the Adeptus Astartes, the Telepaths, the Adeptus Astra Telepathicus, the Psychers, the Inquisition, Holy Terra, the Emperor of Mankind. All of these things, the Imperium of Man, came out with this book, and I believe it was printed in '88. I'm actually looking through it right now. Yes, copyright 1987, Games Workshop Limited. So you have so many names in here that now are considered titans in the industry. So Rick Priestley, Brian Ansell contributed, Jez Goodwin, he wrote in White Dwarf magazine. John Blanche, who just retired this month, he had been doing art for Games Workshop for 40 years. Nick Bibby, Ali and Trish Morrison, they went on to make Marauder miniatures. They ended up coming back to Citadel, so they made their own company and contributed miniatures to Warhammer and 40K. Bob Naismith. These are names that if you get old copies of White Dwarf magazine, these were titans in the industry at the time. The illustrations involved: Dave Andrews, John Blanche, Carl Critchlow. He does art, or did art at least, for Magic the Gathering. So you see, these are big recurring names in what I would call the market of dorkdom, right? And what ends up happening is, because the game is in an RPG format, you have weapons that are shared amongst both players. Mm. So if you know anything about 40K, there's this iron grip fascist space government called the Imperium of Man. It rules all of humanity throughout the stars with an iron fist. The Emperor of Man is barely alive on this golden throne. His psychic projection, the Astronomicon, is projected through space so that navigators with psychic powers can follow it home to Earth, and so they don't crash in space, and so on. And you have the Imperium of Man's Imperial Guard. His armies, his legions, and at the very top, you have the Custodes that protect the Emperor at all times. You have Imperial Assassins, arms of the Inquisition, the secretive group that protects the Imperium from threats within and without. The Xenos, the foul alien, the heretic, that sort of thing. All of this stuff is determined in the initial rulebook for Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader by 1987. What you don't see is you don't see chaos. Mm-hmm. So by the first edition of this game, you have Zotes, which are no longer in the game. I believe they're referenced in Blackstone Fortress, so they've come back recently. Before a long period of time, there were these centaur kind of space hybrid creatures that served the Tyranids. The Tyranids existed. They were very obviously taken from Ridley Scott's Alien. Mm-hmm. And Alien.
Oh yeah, they're 100%. That's Alien.
Very obviously. Yeah, so they're initially in the first rule set. You have the Eldar. Their name has been changed to the Eldari because the term Eldar is taken directly from Tolkien. Yeah. Space elves. You have squats, which are they're covered under abhumans. So squats are space dwarves. You have ratlings that are space halflings. You have ogrins that are space ogres. And in 40K, they're like, hey, how do we get these minis into space so that people keep buying what they like? Well, they're abhumans based on the gravitational forces of the planet, or based on radiation, or other features. Humanity, they're still human, but they've been mutated or morphed or they've evolved. So
by whatever planet they've been on for 10,000 years or whatever.
And where does that come from? In Warhammer Fantasy Battle, there are Imperial dwarves, so there's a line of dwarf miniatures that you could play with the Empire, which were the human faction. So you have dwarves working with humans in the fantasy faction. So what do? We just roll it into the science fiction version of the game.
So they take the molds and turn the axes into guns.
Absolutely. It's a very short hop. The SWAT line of miniatures, they have bikes, so they're all bikers. They wear leather. They've got like Lego space, like they look very much like the helmets from from Lego space sets. They got like the visor.
Yeah.
They look like bikers with beards and everything. The space orcs at the time look like outlaw bikers. They've got like pickle hog helmets, and they've got spiky shoulder pads, and they're wearing chainmail and leather. It looks very, very Road Warrior, right? So what ends up happening is, because it's a role-playing game, it's designed where you are a rogue trader. You are essentially a privateer that is commissioned by the emperor to go in places that the Holy Astronomicon, the light of the Emperor, does not touch. Spread forth his name and steal ancient secrets and get wealthy and famous or die trying. Right? You have a writ of warp travel. You have permission to travel the warp on your own and go adventuring. So the idea is you could have a small force of space marines. You could have an Imperial Guard with you. You could have a retinue, like a psyker, a person with psionic powers with you. And you could pick weapons from a war gear list. So you could be like, hey, he's got a bolter, he's got a shuriken catapult, he's got a plasma gun. These are terms that are now synonymous with the lore. But at the time, they were shared by multiple factions. So you had gene stealer cults, people who worshipped the Tyranids and were slowly introducing their DNA and becoming mutated. And everyone had similar weapons pools. And what ended up happening is Errata, additional rules were just continuously being published in White Dwarf magazine each and every month. So you had to keep buying issues to keep up with the rule set.
Yeah.
And so Chaos, if you don't know anything about 40K, you might have seen the video games. You might have seen Dawn of War, which made Gamesworkshop a ton of money in the early aughts. You might recognize Tyranids and Orcs were the big factions in the 90s. I remember them printed all over White Dwarf magazine. They were selling like hotcakes. Nowadays, I think it's pretty firmly Chaos. Chaos is, I believe, the second most played faction in the game based on popularity polls at Adepticon and so on. Chaos is nowhere to be seen. It's you don't see Chaos until the Realm of Chaos source books, which come out, I believe, 87 to 88. There's a great online blog called Realm of Chaos 80s at Blogspot. It's basically a time capsule back into that period. And they've got a lot of articles on The Lost and the Damned, which was the first Chaos source book. It covers, I believe, Nurgle and Tzeentch. And there's interviews with Rick Priestley and Bill King and Brian Ansell about like the name Tzeentch, the chaos god of perfidy and scheming and secrets. It was meant to be the sound of a spell, like lightning coming out of the hands, like a Doctor Strange comic.
Yeah,
it was supposed to be like Aztec. The feathers were supposed to have an Aztec feel. So these are design choices. If you look at miniatures today on the Games Workshop web store, these are design choices that are still being used. Feathers, lots of rainbow-colored feathers on Tzeentch guys, lots of different tentacles, asymmetry. Nurgle has pustules, and they're green, and they're gross because he's the god of decay and rot and corruption. These have been relatively unchanged for going on 35, 40 years from the origins.
Yeah, the war guys are big and red and angry and have horns and spikes.
So Khorne and Slaanesh come out in 88, I believe, and they have their own book. So there's the Lost, and I believe it's Slaves to Darkness, I think, was that book. And Slaves to Darkness is a big one, because what ends up happening is the Horus Heresy gets its first mention in Slaves to Darkness. Now, this is the prequel series of Star Wars. This is the original series of Star Trek. This is the prequel, the year 30,000 before the year 40,000. It's when everything goes to pot. You have a massive civil war. The Emperor...
It's like by this point, like around 30K, everything's starting to do kind of well, right? Like even if it's like the dark future of humanity or whatever. Like the 30th millennium, you had... like there's good stuff going on. The galaxy's getting united again. We're beating back the forces of, the Xenos, and there's no Tyranid cults popping up. We got a handle on all the orc shit. And then this happens.
Yes. Yeah, so the Great Crusade, this massive campaign where the Emperor and his Primarchs, his genetically programmed sons, go on and cleanse the universe of evil and aliens and heretics and colonize it for humankind has been successful. And then Horus falls to chaos, and there's a civil war amongst the Primarchs. The Imperium is sundered. Ferrus Manus is killed, and Sanguinius is killed, and Horus is destroyed, and the Emperor is left a rotting carcass on the throne, only able to project his psychic entity. And so there's, how did we get here to this setting? Isn't even explained until this companion volume. So we're very, very early on in the story, but you do see these visual elements, these story elements. So there's always this famed cynicism, this sort of black humor bent to the universe. There's a book called the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer. It's a book that every Imperial soldier is supposed to carry on them. They've actually printed it. So I've read it cover to cover, and in it says like any soldier caught attempting to commit suicide will be killed.
Yeah.
It's like there's always this tongue-in-cheek humor. There's references in early publications to music, and there's all sorts of inside jokes. There's
well, even in that pamphlet, there's a whole thing. There's like a section on orcs, and just like, oh, don't worry about orcs. They're weak. Don't worry about them. They're like, basically, it's like they're describing grots, but like this whole thing is like, oh, I'm sure you've heard about these green-skinned brutes named orcs. Well, they're all right. They're like, you'll be able to defeat them easily. They're cowards. And then imagine them being like reading this as an Imperial Guardsman, and then the first time you meet an orc.
Good gracious, they're twice as tall as me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're 8 feet tall. They get back up after you cut their heads off. And
the concept of the wog. We've done a previous episode on orcs in Gamesworkshop. And so the concept of the wog, the concept of Gork and Mork, guess what? It's literally the same as Warhammer Fantasy Battle. They're taken straight from Warhammer Fantasy, deposited straight into this game. They're near identical. Different named characters perhaps, but they got shootas, and they like to paint things red because it goes faster. And guess what? Since they believe it, it's actually true. So the earliest vestiges of these factions are very much there. The idea of the Eldar, the space elves. This race that's slowly dwindling and diminishing. That's obviously taken from Tolkien. What they end up doing is by the time Slaves of Darkness comes out, they reveal, guess what? The Eldar are responsible for Slaanesh. And centuries, thousands of years of vice and ostentatious behavior and complete avarice.
Murder fucking. You can say murder fucking.
Murder fucking for centuries. The psychic energy of these space elves just being terrible people for that long, created a literal chaos god of vice that is both and all genders. Yet the sculpting of Slaanesh in the mid to late 80s of like healed stripper heels and one breast and one flat chest and pierced nipples and all sorts of like lobster claws, all sorts of gross stuff. Bulls' heads and goats' heads. That sculpting idea comes from the 80s. That's still done today. You see the demonettes of Slaanesh.
Yeah.
You see these design ideas which still exist within the company. So all of the big check marks that you're used to, you see in this period. However, the size of the lore it's like a Big Bang. The size of the lore has not expanded yet.
Yeah.
So
we've only gotten at this point, we've only gotten what we can get from source books and rule books, right? They haven't started publishing.
Source books, the 40K Road Trader book, you had to wait a year for Slaves of Darkness, you had to wait 2 years for Lost and the Damned, you had to wait each month to see what they would publish in White Dwarf magazine, because there were errors, there were printing errors. To explain the rules. Playing in high school, there were times where some of the grognards, right, the old school hobbyists would play first edition 40K. And the number one thing that I look back on with reverence is orc players of Road Trader. Because the explanation of how many orcs you could fit in a truck was only explained in terms of 2 dimensions.
Yeah.
You have this by this to fit as many orcs as you can in the truck. No, that was the rule. So players would build a wire basket coming out of the truck in the Z direction, upwards into the sky, like a silo, and fill it with orc miniatures. Because according to Rogue Trader, first edition rules, that was legal. So you could fit like 50 orcs into a truck because you created a literal basket, and according to the rules, you could dump them in.
Yeah.
So there's these holes, this errata in the rule set at this time that I guess you could say adds character. You had some of the first contests in terms of gameplay. I think 89. There's probably someone in their mid 50s, early 60s who's British who will watch this and correct me with a deft hand. But from a hobbyist perspective, who's coming off the cuff, these are things I recall. You see all the little vestiges of what's now, but smaller. Mm-hmm. The Battle of Prospero, the Space Wolves being ordered by the Emperor to exterminate the homeworld of the Thousand Suns. That stuff isn't like the box set and eccentricities of all the books explaining what happened, and like Sanguinius being afraid that the defect in his gene seed is revealed because he doesn't want the Ninth Legion being destroyed. These are things that are expanded upon in the books today in the Horus Heresy series. I believe The End and the Death, what just came out. So this is stuff that's been retroactively explained, but the origins of it, the very, the glint in the eye, is determined in the 80s. You also see ideas that you no longer see in the game. So I mentioned Zotes. There are these giant centaur beings that serve the Tyranids. They come back in limited capacity later on. I believe they're in Blackstone Fortress, but you see lots of ideas that sort of fell by the wayside.
What is the most important?
I'll see if I can find some Zotes.
I was about to say
40k.
Oh, those are weird looking fuckers.
Yes, to say the very least. I'm gonna look up Zotes.
I was not envisioning lizard men.
Yeah, there are lots of ideas that are touched upon. This is actually taken directly from White Dwarf magazine. So you can see the allure, right? When you're a kid, you go in the store and there are pieces of lead in a bag. You see these full color painted miniatures sitting there in the magazine. Now, the first one I read was 1997, so I think this may predate my birth. But this is what draws you in as a kid, and this is what you think about years later. In fact, this is January of '88, so I wouldn't be born for another 6, nearly 7 months. Mm-hmm. But you see the vestiges of what's there, because they are genetic slaves to the Tyranids, so they no longer exist, or at least they don't exist for decades. The squats are exterminated, I believe, in 89, 90, the late 80s perhaps, are exterminated, and they're not brought back until Release of Votan, which is within the past 2 years.
It was last year, I think, actually.
Yeah, last year. So everything that is old is new again. I think they realize everyone who grew up with that stuff now has expendable income. Because, hey, it is a business, and what's profitable drives the business. Yeah,
that's kind of what you see a little bit is they're doing stuff and they're making all these things, and then when it doesn't sell well, they're like, well, I'm not going to keep shipping these out if no one's going to buy them, so then they just kill it. Yes. And then people are like, but why? Because it's like, you're like, there's like literally 100 of you that like play this faction.
Yeah, a lot of rules that were just invented on the cuff. So the Space Fleet game of having Warhammer 40,000 Battles in Space was first printed in White Dwarf magazine. There were cards you could cut out. Mm-hmm. There's a grid you could put your spaceships on. It was the Imperial Navy versus the Eldar. And eventually there's a box set for Space Fleet. I believe it's 90. And then you don't see anything until the late 90s, early 2000s with Battlefleet Gothic, which is years later, a specialist game. So it's sort of like Valiant or Marvel Knights comics are like a more mature label for Marvel, mm-hmm. Or Eclipse comics. These are like mature label comics owned by Marvel DC. It's like that. Specialist games are like a more under the microscope game for very particular rule sets. So you have Necromunda doesn't exist yet. Necromunda was created in its initial form in a game called Confrontation, which doesn't exist until I believe around 8990. So that doesn't exist yet. You get what predates Necromunda, what predates Mordheim, what predates Space Fleet and Battlefleet Gothic is Blood Bowl. So, but again, this is a 40k episode. But
tell me about Blood Bowl.
But yeah, just to throw out that they're just trying everything in the magazine. See if it sticks. Blood Bowl is very simply literal fantasy football. So the football itself is spiked. You have teams of linemen and you have receivers. The early rules of the game had.
I thought the football was a squig. Is that not a thing?
It's an official football.
Oh, okay.
What ends up happening is the orcs have rules where they can have squigs in the field, and I believe they can eat the ball. A goblin can pick up the ball, and then you can throw the goblin.
Yeah.
So you have all these. The rules are ridiculous. The dwarves get like this moving lawnmower thing they can run over people with. It's zany. It's off the wall. It was by design a caricature of American football designed by Brits. So it's. And it's still around. It's there's the Chaos Cup in Chicago. There's still major events. The NAF is actually a presiding body that covers the points at major events. So there's an international ranking system for Blood Bowl. So you have diehard fans of some of these properties coming from this golden era in the mid to late 80s of the stuff being published in White Dwarf magazine. And we talked about some ideas not making the grade. So if you have friends who are in 40K, if you've been looking at 40K, if you're an old veteran, you may notice the Adeptus Astartes, the Mickey Mouse of Games Workshop, right? The Bugs Bunny, the corporate logo, the Hello Kitty, the moneymaker. Everyone has seen a Space Marine statue at Gen Con or Adepticon or even maybe in C2E2. I don't know if they go there. But at the very least, everyone's seen a Space Marine. Video games, television, commercials, what have you. Especially with the show coming up. They're the genetically
I feel like
designed.
And anyone that knows anything, like if you know the existence of 40K, you've seen a Space Marine.
Exactly. And the first thing
annoyingly a blue one, but whatever.
What's the first thing that you may notice, Ben, if you looked at a glut of Space Marines?
Skulls? Big?
Maybe. What happens if I take off all their helmets? What do you notice?
Big and bald.
Why are they bald?
Because I don't know.
Does that help?
Glasses?
They are all male.
Oh, they're all dudes. Got it. Yeah.
Yes, even though in the story there, I believe they're castrated, or at least they're not able to reproduce.
Yeah, I believe that GW confirmed that no Space Marines cannot bump uglies. Yeah, and have no interest in bumping uglies.
Right. They have multiple hearts and multiple stomachs, and they can spit acid, and some of them can learn memories from tissue that they chew from their enemies.
They've never told us whether or not it's a Ken doll down there, though.
So there are explanations of like the black carapace, that like what they put on before they put on the suit, and there have been references to how a Space Marine is made. All you need to know is it doesn't work down there, and there's no need for it to work down there.
Yeah.
Now, there were and have been female Space Marines. They are absolutely canonical. They did exist, and they were sold. The reason why you don't see them anymore and why they're not brought up anymore is because they didn't sell. At least that's the story that they give. There were 2 female Space Marine miniatures that were made. They were, of course, advertised in White Dwarf magazine. They're now prohibitively expensive to obtain. There are people that make like fan sculpts that are similar just because it's so hard to find the original one. So yeah, there were female Space Marines. Apparently, the demographic of the hobby at the time was probably pervasively male and most likely heavily Caucasian. And so what ended up happening is you see a lot of miniatures at the time period were Caucasian. Nearly all of them, except for maybe like Blood Bowl cheerleaders and so on, were male. I have a female commissar, the officers of the Imperial Guard that I got from Games Day. That is, you look online, you can sell for $40. That should not be rare, right? And so you see nowadays with the newer miniatures lines, you see the Sisters of Silence, you see the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, you see female commissars, female Imperial Guardsmen come with the Cadia Stands box set, right? So there's salamanders. So you see multiple races, multiple ethnic backgrounds, multiple genders being more represented in the game, but at that time, not at all. In fact, the two female Space Marine miniatures you see are no longer produced. And squats end up being... the term being squatted was a term that was used at the Games Workshop Battle Bunker when I was growing up. It's like, oh, hey, that box is being squatted at the end of the month, so it's a markup. You guys want to buy it. It became a term for something being just eked out of existence.
Yeah.
Just removed from the catalogs, removed from the storyline, and what have you. There are Space Marine chapters. So the chapters are sort of like the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, the knightly orders you would think of in history, in medieval history, are represented by the Space Marines. So they are sorted into chapters. Each chapter can loosely or closely follow the Codex Astartes, the book of rules that you're supposed to follow. You see a lot of Space Marine chapters. In fact, opening page of the book. I don't know if this is copyrighted material or not, so I'm not going to show the page of the book.
I'm going to show it anyway. We're not printing it.
We don't have enough viewers. Okay, so if I share the screen, you actually see. You see in the contents, you see references to the very first Space Marine chapters that are introduced in the game. So, let me take a look here at my own screen. So this looks like they're kind of hard to even tell what they are. Here we go. So you see, this is the Blood Angels.
Oh yeah.
Blood Drinkers, Crimson Fists, Dark Angels. I believe that's the Flesh Terrors, the Saw Blade. I don't. That might be Flesh Eaters or something. I don't even recognize the jaws.
Oh, so at this point, we've already even got the chapters splitting apart, not just like the Legion. It's not like the legions themselves.
There's no there's no Horus Heresy yet, but we do know that there are chapters because they wanted people to buy miniatures to paint them their own way.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Iron Hands. These are the Rainbow Warriors, Silver Skulls, Space Wolves, Ultramarines, and White Scars. I'm pretty proud of myself. I think I
good job.
Yeah. Now the game is so old at this point. The Dark Angels are black. Their armor's not green. The Imperial Fists are not even in the game. The Crimson Fists are the only ones that exist. They're on the box set. I believe they're on the cover. Yeah, the Crimson Fists are on the cover of the book itself. So what ends up happening is they get retconned into being a successor chapter.
So wait, are Ultramarines not on there?
Ultramarines are towards
okay. I missed it.
Ultramarines are actually not the Mickey Mouse. They're not the corporate logo yet. The Crimson Fists are pushed as the cover boys at this point in the game. Imperial Fists, if you've heard of Chapter Master Valrock on YouTube, there's a lot of staunch fans of the Imperial Fists. In the 90s,
well, they're good.
Big chapters for the Blood Angels. They were red. The Ultramarines were blue. The Imperial Fists were yellow. They were all in the Space Crusade, highly successful computer game. To an extent, the Space Wolves had a strong following at this time as well. But those are like the big four. I'd say five if you include the Dark Angels. And what ends up happening is some of these fall out of favor. So the Rainbow Warriors are famously not really covered anymore. You'll see references to them in Games Day, Golden Demon, like the painting competition, but they've sort of fallen by the wayside. The Silver Skulls, you'll see some references to them, but they're considered a successor chapter. So based on sales and based on what was being published, certain chapters end up becoming way more popular. The Blood Drinkers, the Flesh Terrors, these end up becoming retconned as successor chapters of the Blood Angels. So they are descended from the Blood Angels. They're all descended from Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Ninth Legion. Iron Hands I'd say the Iron Hands here, the Space Wolves, Ultramarines, White Scars, Dark Angels, and Blood Angels are considered a big deal because they are chosen to be some of the first founded chapters. So I believe initially 20 were made, the Second Legion, and maybe the 10th or the 11th. 2 of the legions are lost to time, and we don't talk about them and why they were lost. So the 18 remaining legions in the story are the first founding legions of the Space Marines that the Emperor himself devised. And so some of these groups you see initially, based on sales, became huge names in the company, in the lore, in the magazines, in the books. Some of them not so much. So you see a lot of origins.
There's like shifting around because at this point, now we're at like there's 18 legions.
Yeah,
there's 18 legions and that initial list you said, there were like most of those have been relegated to being successor chapters. They're not even their own thing. So like they're like basically the 3 big ones or 3 or 4 big ones that sold well got bumped up to like, oh, these are the OG, and then like everybody else that didn't, they're like, well, you can still paint them that way, but they're not actually their own thing.
Yeah, precisely. And what I've been talking about today assumes that you have at least a base visual knowledge of 40K, or maybe you've played a few times. If you're new to the game, if you're completely new to the game, you might not have any idea what I'm talking about. If you've never even seen a Space Marine,
well, it's even funny how the helmets changed, because like now I know why like orcs call them beakies, because it looks like they've got a beak helmet or whatever. Yeah.
Yes. So in the 1980s. For those who are uninitiated, I'll show the cover again. Very famously, they're now known as Corvus patterned Space Marine helmets. Corvus being Latin for, I believe, raven. Yeah. And references to, I think, Corvus Corax came up with them.
Yeah. So is this like, would this be like a Mark 1 armor or whatever the heck they call it? They've got the...
Technically, I believe these are Mark 6.
Okay.
So they actually did come up with the Thunder Warriors, like the progenitors of the Space Marines, like the sort of beta test of Space Marines, had the Thunder armor. And so canonically, just like Star Wars sort of began with Episode 4, the power armor from the first edition of the game, this was devised as Mark 6 Corvus power armor, as I recall. Again, correct me, eviscerate me in the comments if I'm wrong. But these beaky helmets, the orcs call them beakies. You see these in all the original sculpts. You see them today in veteran squads, because canonically in the story, old war gear is still used by the chapters.
Yeah.
And so you see the Raven Guard especially favor this helmet, as it's named after their primary Corvus Corax. Yes, his name is Raven, and he leads the Raven Guard. So, so there's all these little tongue-in-cheek things that are done at the beginning of this game.
That they just yes and keep going.
Will it sell? Our primary audience is kids, so will it sell? If it does, let's keep printing.
Yeah.
You do see plastic multi-post kits at this time. The first Space Marine box, I believe, was in the late 80s. You get plastic Space Orcs at the time, so plastic minis did exist alongside the lead. You get Space Orcs, you get the Eldar, you get Dreadnoughts, these big hulking weapon wielding monstrosities that were once Space Marines. Squats get exo armor, so the little dwarves get their own little versions of Terminator armor. So you get Terminator armor at this time. You get land speeders. So stuff that you see in today's product line was devised at this time. My personal favorite game is Epic 40K. It's actually 6mm 40K. That was first devised with rules called Space Marine, which I believe are 8990 that don't exist yet. So they're like massive scale battles. So the Space Marines are literally this big. When a standard Space Marine is like 20mm, Space Marines are now 6mm. So you can have Titans. The first example of the Demon Primarch Magnus the Red is an epic, because you can just put him on a 20mm base and he's that big.
Yeah.
Adeptus Titanicus, the first game that came out of the lore about Titans.
Yeah.
That led into Space Marine, into epic, having Titan scale combat. That all was devised after this game came out. So a lot of these ideas come after the fact. With 10th Ed 40K coming out, you and myself have both purchased the Leviathan box coming out. All of the rules are being posted online for all the factions, reportedly at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Purpose of balance.
They've already released some of them.
Yes, they have, and they've demoed some of them in White Dwarf magazine. That was not the case.
And apparently, Eldar are unbeatable currently.
Yeah, there was a current GT event, but one of the GTs did not allow Eldar to be played because the balancing was not complete. At this time, rules came out when you got them.
Yeah.
And certain factions were busted until they weren't. And
you had to wait. You'd have to wait like years until the next codex came out that would fix it.
Literal years. Now, I'm trying to think of anything I missed, but like visually, the designs are there from John Blanche's illustrations. The one thing that does hold together first ed, 40K to second to third, and so on, all the way up to 10th ed, is the visual design of the art and lore. A lot of the storyline from the original Road Trader rulebook still applies today. The term Imperial Guard has been changed to Astra Militarum for the purposes of intellectual property rights. But for the most part, the Eldar are the Eldari, but a lot of it is essentially there. The core of it is there. The art is contiguous throughout. So John Blanche's art from 1986 to today has always been there. It's a shame to see him go, but he's earned his retirement. He's a titan in the hobby. If you see a John Blanche illustration, you will not be able to tell if it's from 2011, 1999, or 1986. That's how consistent they've been with the art design. Wayne England. There's a few names I think of. What pulls me back into this world is the books, the art design, and the beginnings of the lore from this period. So the rules themselves are absolutely wonky. They're completely imbalanced. Second ed is when you start seeing more reliable. I mean, they're not fully balanced, but you see like vehicle rules with individual sponsons, and you have actual contests and like 40K tournaments and so on. Rogue Trader, it's a bit bumpy.
Yeah.
You need a game master just to run the game.
Right.
But
you have to have a third party in order to solve the arguments that occur.
yeah. Lore wise and intellectual property wise, the bumps are there. I didn't want to get too much into the history of the company itself because that might derail us. But if we want to get more into individual ideas about the Imperium, like we could talk about the Primarchs, the Horus Heresy. Predating the Horus Heresy is actually the Bad Ab War. So that they invented a conflict that was supposed to reference the fact that individual fiefdoms of knights would actually come into conflict with one another in medieval times. So they were, fiefdoms. There were holdings of land that are awarded to Space Marines, where Space Marines actually entered rebellion against each other, and that conflict was called the Bad Ab War. That was from the late 80s. I'm not sure if it certainly predates the expansion of all the Horus Heresy books. I don't know if it came directly before. It's all in like 88, 89 right there.
And did that get like retconned?
So the Bad Ab War does exist. Very famously, the Salamanders chapter is from the Bad Ab War, and they were rolled into one of the founding chapters, one of the OG chapters of Space Marines. So you have, I think, the Firehawks. You have the Mantis Warriors.
Some of those names are from Cursed Founding, though.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is the two big chapters, I believe, are the Salamanders and the Lamenters are from the Bad Ab War. They're a very popular successor chapter of the Blood Angels that historically have gone through many, many trials.
Yeah.
And so
they're sad.
They've earned their lamentations.
Yeah.
But yeah, the ideas of like the Eldar, the individual factions we could go into, but I really wanted to focus on a key element of the pieces that fell together that became the first edition of the game for those who are uninitiated, because it looks very, very different from how it does today. The Space Marines alone are different in size, different appearance. Factions share weapons. There's all sorts of strange things in that time period, but it was a resounding success. Rick Priestley still designs games today. A lot of these guys, like Gav Thorpe, is still in the game business, but not with Gamesworkshop. So the Perry brothers still sculpts. So a lot of these individuals are still making art today. If you look, and that brings warmth to my heart. But in 1986. 1987, with the printing of Warhammer 40K Road Trader, they made something that is now, in my opinion, the biggest intellectual property pop culture, other than obviously Harry Potter coming out of the UK. you could argue James Bond, Doctor Who, but
well, just like the library alone of books, you can like, I could read a freaking book a week of 40K and be occupied for 5 years, you know, or don't even know how long it'd take me to get through the entire library. But
yeah, there's a particular reason why Made in the UK is on half the stuff in my basement, and that is Games Workshop.
Yeah, so that gets us through like the beginnings of 40K and sort of like the business.
86 to 90, I would say.
So let's say our next episode, let's talk about the Badab War, because I don't know a whole lot about that. So,
okay. It's an overlooked. It's almost like the Korean War. It's an overlooked.
Yeah, because Badab War, that was pretty bad, but then the Horus Heresy happened, you know. So so that's what we'll be covering next time, is the Badab War, and a little bit of we'll get some lore going on this time instead of just an overview. And then again, reminder: the book for Monday is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by, if I can find it, by Theodora Goss. And Joel started it, and he said he's loving it so far, so that's a good sign. And other than that, catch us on Thursdays for Dungeons and Dragons, where we'll be continuing our Greek campaign.
Cool. One final thing for our audience out there: if you're interested more in the lore, if you're like, hey, help me, there's so many books, tell me a story, let us know. We can focus on that. If you're interested in Oitorf magazine, if you're interested in the eccentricities of the business, that sort of thing, let us know how you liked this week's episode. There's a lot to talk about. I wasted a lot of my life on this.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in story, we're focusing on the Badab War next week. Catch us this week, Thursday, for D&D.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for watching.